Hello all, and welcome back to Intro to American Studies. I hope you all found some rest and relaxation over spring break. And this is the last reading of our second unit, which has added gender and sexuality to the first unit's focus on race and ethnicity. And more generally, we've been looking at this idea of intersectionality, including all of those and more. So this week is our first reading that focuses on the experiences of people with sexualities other than sort of normative heterosexuality. And I chose it partially because the author, Timothy Stewart Winter, is a professor here at Rutgers Newark in both the American Studies and Women's and Gender Studies programs. So if you're interested in these topics, you should definitely seek him out for a chat or take a class of his. But mostly I chose it for the same reason as all the others, because it expanded my understanding of America. And it did so by showing how the movements for gay liberation and Black liberation briefly overlapped in their common fight against police brutality in the late 1960s. And it shows how this coalition fell apart in the 1970s due to the intersecting race, class, and sexual experiences of the different activists involved. So often when we talk about police brutality, we view it as a Black issue, but Stewart Winter shows how police brutality was a queer issue in the late 1960s, and it still is a queer issue, mostly for queer people of color. So Stewart Winter is focusing on Chicago in the post-war era, and he explains that in the years after World War II, there were a lot of laws designed to persecute people for expressing their gender or sexuality in creative ways. So there were laws against wearing clothes that didn't match your assigned gender, laws against expressing affection or soliciting sex with people of the same gender as you. All of these behaviors were considered vices, and the police would go around beating people up and arresting people for doing these things. And of course, Black people in general, queer or otherwise, were also being beaten up and arrested by the police just for living their lives as Black people. And so it makes sense that, as Stewart Winter shows us, some queer activist groups and Black activist groups joined forces in the late 1960s to fight the police brutality that they were all facing. And so the first way this reading expanded my understanding of America was because I had not thought about or realized that there was this queer Black coalition fighting against police brutality. You know, I feel like I've heard a lot about Black movements against police brutality, but not so much about queer ones. However, unfortunately, Stewart Winter shows us that this coalition did not last very long. And why not? Because of the race and class dynamics that intersected with queer activism. So by the 1970s, white, gay, middle-class men had been relatively successful at getting the police off their backs. And so here's a classic example of how intersectionality works in the real world, right? These are power dynamics that shape how people live their lives, right? And so even though these activists were persecuted for being gay, they had racial power as white people, they had gender power as men, and they had class power as middle-class people. And so they were able to use these other sources of power to convince politicians and other citizens to get rid of a lot of these laws against queer behavior, to basically decriminalize queer behavior. And then many of these activists moved on to other issues. So in the 1980s, HIV/AIDS, and in the 1990s, gay marriage. But who was left behind? Well, all of the other queer people who did not have these racial, gender, or class advantages. Queer people of color, queer women, queer working class and poor people. And what else is happening in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, right? Just as this coalition falls apart, the growth of mass incarceration, which Stewart Winter also calls the carceral state. This is the massive growth in public and private prisons and harsh sentencing laws, which resulted in a massive increase in the number of people sent to U.S. prisons. And if this is new information to you, please watch Ava DuVernay's film 13th on Netflix. Recommend. This is also, incidentally, the tough on crime policies that President Biden was apologizing for his role in enacting on the campaign trail. Because a lot of that happened during the Clinton administration when he was the vice president. Nope, when he was in Congress. The Clinton administration when Joe Biden was in Congress. So at the very same time that white middle-class gay men are successful at getting the police off of their backs, and then they move on to these other issues that affect them and others, but that are now affecting them more directly because the police, right, are less of an issue, then Black people in general, including Black gay men and Black queer people in general, are being policed and incarcerated more and more heavily, right? So these communities that were in coalition briefly are now moving in opposite directions, right? White middle-class gay men are not being criminalized, right? They're not being arrested and harassed at the same levels than they were. And Black people in general, including Black gay people, Black queer people, are being incarcerated more and more along, right, with this system of mass incarceration that's being erected. So, to me, Stewart Winter implies, he doesn't necessarily say this, but he implies that if white middle-class gay men had stuck by their Black comrades that they had been fighting alongside in the 1960s, then maybe this could have played out differently. Maybe there could have been a more massive and successful fight against mass incarceration in the 80s and 90s. But who knows? So, through this intersectional analysis of race, class, gender, and sexuality, Stewart Winter shows how poor and working class queer Black people are some of the most heavily affected by police brutality, especially transgender Black women, but they are rarely the face of movements against police brutality. And so we see how when we're talking about police brutality, we cannot just be talking about race. We have to also be talking about gender and sexuality and class in order to understand who experiences the most violence and how people have worked both together and separately to fight for justice. So those are my thoughts on Tim Stewart Winter's article about queer law and order. As usual, your reflections are due Sunday at midnight, and you should start thinking about how you can add an intersectional analysis to your research question, as the next step in your imaginary research project will be the next assignment.